Okay. Good evening to everyone. Okay. And so this week we're doing Parshat Balotcha, which is a really power-packed parsha. It's got everything. It starts off with very spiritual material about lighting the menorah, and then there are certain mitzvot, and then there is the beginning of the actual travel in the desert, the famous psukim Vayehi bin Sarah Ha'aron, and it was when the ark traveled, and then there are the sad, difficult stories of the Jews complaining. It's just got a tremendous amount of material in it, but we're going to take a look at one pasuk towards the end of chapter 10. It's, I think, the fifth verse or fourth verse from the end of chapter 10. And this, to a certain extent, is the verse that people might expect to have been the first verse in the book of Bamidbar, because we call the book of Bamidbar, Numbers, we call it the book of the wilderness, and this is for the first time when the Jews are moving into the Midbar, desert/wilderness, and it says Vayis'u mehar Hashem derech Shloshet Yamim, and they traveled. The JPS translation first says marched. I would translate traveled, but okay. They traveled from the mountain of God, Shloshet Yamim, 3 days. A travel of 3 days. The Shloshet is not Shlosha Yamim, 3 days. It's of 3 days. But okay, we'll talk about that. The Aaron Brit Hashem, and the ark, the box of the covenant, was Nosei Lifneihem, traveled in front of them. Okay? It's interesting that JPS says the Jews marched, same word for the ark, he translates it as traveled. I don't know why he changes the English, because in the Hebrews this name, but okay. And Nosei Lifneihem derech Shloshet Yamim, for 3 days. Why 3 days again? Why do we repeat? It's like a funny verse, okay? Latur lahem menucha. So the 3 days journey was latur. Now here the translation says to seek. Latur, in modern Hebrew, a tayar is a traveler or a tourist. Lator is the same word that's going to be used in next week's Torah reading about the spies or the scouts going into territory. So I would translate perhaps to scout, to look for, to search for, rather than seek. Seek is more, I don't know. I would like a word that has to do with like wandering around looking for something, searching out. Okay. To find for them a resting place. In other words, a good place to encamp. So they move for 3 days, and during this time, there is an effort to find a good place to stop after the 3-day journey. That's what seems to be going on, but it's a difficult verse. It repeats the 3 days. There's a number of problems in the verse. So we're going to deal with the problems in the verse in 3 different ways. The first way we're going to do it is called drasha. We are going to examine the material, and this is midrash. We are going to look at the material and look for usual structures in the words or the grammar. So we're going to do that first. Then we're going to take a look at the place of this verse in the literary structure of the book. And we're going to see 2 commentaries. They're going to talk about that. And then at the end, we're going to take a look at 2 more commentaries that are going to look at the spiritual message in this verse. And that's sort of Kabbalistic. Those are going to be Hasidic sources. So first, let's begin with 4 common commentaries that are going to talk about drashot, like rabbinic exposition of problems in the verse. Okay, and we'll start with Rashi. Rashi says, Derech Shloshet Yamim, a path which was of 3 days. And it's like, it's a funny, you'd think it would say, it would be that, Halchu Shlosha Yamim, 3 days. Why Shloshet, a trip of 3 days? So Rashi says the funny language teaches us a distance of 3 days journey that they miraculously traveled in 1 day, because the Holy One, blessed be He, desired to bring them straight away into the land. That God did something that we in other places in Chumash we call Tfitzat Derech. God jumped the land for them, so they were moving, at super speed, and therefore did 3 days worth of travel in 1 day. So that's Rashi's solution to the funny language of Shloshet Yamim. Okay, but then Rashi has another problem. It says the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord went before them. That's a problem, because in last week's Torah reading, actually 2 weeks ago in Bamidbar, we spent a lot of time going through the order of the march in the desert, and clearly the Ark is in the middle. You have the first 2 camps, then you have the camp of the Leviim that carry the portable Mishkan, portable temple that they take apart and put together, and that's where the Aron is, in the middle, and then the last 2 sections of the camp, because there are 3 on each side of the camp. There are 3 tribes. So you have 6 tribes, 3 and 3, then you have the Leviim in the middle, and then 6 more tribes at the end. But here it doesn't say that the Ark is in the middle, the Ark is at the front. So Rashi says, that must mean this was a different Ark. This was that went with them whenever they waged war, in which the broken tablets were placed. This Ark was made by Moshe Rabbeinu before Bezalel made the beautiful Ark that had gold on top and the angels on top. And this Ark, during the time in the desert, had in it the broken tablets, while the other Ark had the second set of tablets, and later has a bottle of man, later has a copy of the Sefer Torah, later has the copper snake, has all sorts of other things. So Rashi says this was a separate Ark. Again, it's a problem in the text, and Rashi solves it by saying, there must have been 2 Arks. We don't know much about this second Ark, but apparently they used it during this period of Jewish history. That's Rashi, the Rashbam. But the meaning of the rabbis that they set forth from the mountain of the eternal indicates a punishment. In other words, leaving Har Sinai was a punishment. Now, that doesn't seem to be the literal meaning of the verses, because we know that they're going to leave Har Sinai and go to Eretz Yisrael. So leaving Har Sinai is part of the plan. Why does he say it's a punishment? And he says it's based on an Agada, a midrashic story, that they set forth from Mount Sinai with joy, just like a child who runs away from school saying, we better get out of here now. Why? Perhaps God will give us more commandments if we stay. We better go. If we don't get out of here, God's going to keep teaching more material. There's going to be more stuff on the test quickly. So they were acting like immature school children. Now, why would the Midrash say that? Look back at the Hebrew for just a second. Vayis'u mehar Sinai Mehar Hashem, and they traveled from the mountain of God. That word Mehar, if you read it differently, is Maher, quickly. So in other words, because that word Mehar can also be read, remember the Torah doesn't have vowels, could be easily read Maher, since they traveled swiftly from God. It leads into this midrashic story that they were in a rush to leave Har Sinai because they didn't want God to give them more mitzvot, more Torah. Now, I have a comment on that comment. Rav Gigi is a marvelous Talmid Chacham who's a Rebbe at Yeshivat Har Etzion, and he commented on the Ramban. He said the Ramban's focus here seems to be on the fact that Bnei Yisrael are journeying from God's mountain. He doesn't say like I said. I think what I said is correct. Maher, quickly. And I'm not the only one who says it. There are other people who say it. But Rav Gigi said they were traveling from. And that, I love this idea, actually. They are not journeying towards any goal. Their goal is simply to get away. When we travel through life, we should always have a goal on the horizon. Now, this verse, according to Rav Gigi, would be much better if it didn't say, Vayisu mehar Hashem, Vayisu likrat Eretz Yisrael. If it said they were traveling towards Eretz Yisrael, that would be a much nicer verse, according to Rav Gigi. Because all of life should be goals. We should always be goal-oriented. And we shouldn't be going away from, our behavior shouldn't be to get away from something. It should be to get to something better. And that's why Rav Gigi believes that the Ramban said his comment, even though I think what I said is also true, but I wanted to make both points. And I think this is a lesson for life. When you retire, Rivka and I, my wife and I, very happy to be retired, but we didn't feel like we were getting away from the previous life. We felt like we were moving towards something that we were looking forward to. And we, Baruch Hashem, are filling our days with wonderful things to do. And I think all of life has to be a journey towards something better. So I love the point that Rav Gigi meant, but I don't think it's the source of the Ramban. But okay, Rabbeinu Bechaye, our sages, quotes famous midrash, the word Mehar Hashem as meaning Me'acharei Hashem. They were leaving God, not that much different from Rav Gigi. That as soon as they left the environment of Har Sinai, the people deviated from following God. They literally fled from the nearness of God. They wanted to get out of the shadow of the mountain of God and of God himself. They wanted freedom. They wanted to get away. Why did the sages in Shabbat have to interpret events in this matter? It was to teach us that as soon as the people moved away from Mount Sinai, they no longer felt that they were under the supervision of Hashem. It's a very immature position that we know a lot of people, have. Oh, God's not watching me now. I can get away with anything I want because I'm somehow off God's radar. There's no CCTV on me anymore. This idea, is ridiculous because God absolutely watches everything, which existed only at the mountain of God. So they felt like once they get away from Har Sinai, God's no longer watching them. The expression Har Hashem is opposed to Har Elokim. Back in Shmot, when we talked about where they were camped, it says Har Elokim, the mountain of Elokim. Here they're calling it Har Hashem. And the Rabbeinu Bechaye believes that change of name changes the attitude towards the mountain as well. is so unusual that the sages felt the essence of the move was away from the Torah element associated with the mountain. They were moving away from, I mean, to put it in a modern context, they're moving away from yeshiva. They behave one way while they're in yeshiva, but after they leave yeshiva, when they go out to work or they go to university, they don't necessarily act with the same level of religious seriousness. And it's a very sad commentary. And we'd like to believe that our children and grandchildren are mature enough to stay serious about their Judaism, whether they're in the Beit Midrash or whether they're on the street or in the business world. Last of these kinds of midrashic commentary explaining anomalies, unusual structures in the verse, the Rashbam. He's also concerned with that derech shloshet yamim. Why is it shloshet? A road or a path of 3 days. Shouldn't it be just a derech of 3 days? Not shloshet, but shlosha. And he says something fascinating, which sort of prepares us for what's going to be the next story in our parsha, which is when the Jews start complaining. Because he says they walked for a period of 3 days without stop, not making camp until the end of the third day. They walked 3 days straight. This sounds like some sort of basic training exercise. You have to keep walking until you collapse. Okay, the tzanchanim, the red beret paratroopers are famous for having to do a march of 90 kilometers. Okay, so they just kept on marching and marching for 3 straight days, and then, seeing that this had been very strenuous, the people began grumbling. So the complaining, which comes in chapter 11, this is the end of chapter 10, that all of that complaining was a result of the fact that God overworked them, or Moshe overworked them in this first part of the journey. Okay, interesting. Okay, just finish this up. A phenomenon which also occurred in the last year of the wanderings and is recorded in Numbers 21:4, that at the end of the book, in Parshat Chukat, they start to travel again. In other words, after the sin of the spies in next week's parsha, they stay in Kadesh Barnea for basically 38 years, 37 years, and a few months. And they only travel in the first year and the last year and a half at the beginning and a year at the end. And all the other time, there's no grumbling because they're not traveling. The grumbling, according to, and I think he's right, the grumbling, according to the Rashbam, is connected to the travel. The difficult travel brought about all of the complaining and grumbling that takes place in the chapters 11, 12, 13 here, and then later in chapters 21, 22, 23, later in the book. Okay, very nice. So that's dealing with some of the problems in the verse, and how the wrong foot, and whatever the wrong foot means, either bad attitude or the march was too difficult, but we're setting up all of the complaining that's going to be in the next chapter. The next 2 comments, one from Professor Fox, who wrote a commentary on the entire 5 books of Moses in English from a literary point of view, and from Rabbi Sachs. These comments are a literary analysis of a totally separate problem. And the problem is, we start reading the book of Bamidbar in the wilderness, in the desert, but yet it's a long time till we get into the desert. In other words, the first 10 chapters, 1/3 of the book, there are 36 chapters in the book about Midvat. The first 10 of them, they're not in the desert at all. They're still in the shadow of Mount Sinai. There's a lot of material about getting ready to move before they actually move. And when you look at it in terms of verses, it's even a larger percentage, 420 verses before they take a step outside the camp. There are 1,288 verses in the whole book, and a third of them take place before the Jews take one step outside the camp. That's sort of funny. I mean, there are a couple of books that are like this. Moby Dick. It's many chapters till they actually go out to sea. A lot of chapters getting ready to go to sea, and you got to have a lot of patience. And so both Professor Fox and Rabbi Sachs are going to talk about why there is such a lag time before the Jews start to move. Remember, the book of Vayikra made it sound like they were ready to leave the next day. But then there's a long time, a lot of verses, a lot of material given before we actually move. So Professor Fox says, once the trumpets for signaling the march have been made, the silver trumpets, which are blown to let the Jews know it's time to travel, the Israelites at last begin their trek from Sinai to Canaan, 19 days after the opening events and commandments of the book. We expected the book right away to go right into the desert. It took 19 days and 1/3 of the material. True to the orderly character of part 1, which here draws to a close, the end of the march is laid out tribe by tribe and Levite subgroup by subgroup. The departure sequence ends, as the sections in the Bible sometimes do, with a poem. The poem, Vayehi ben Saharon, Vayomer Moshe, Kuma Hashem, right? So those two verses are a poem that end. There's going to be another poem later in the book that ends the travel when we get right up to the border of Israel, border of Eretz Canaan. And so this, as Professor Fox points out, these verses now completely stripped of their military connotation are universally used by Jews when Torah scrolls are taken out and put back in the synagogue on Sabbaths and holidays. I guess Professor Fox didn't go to shul on Monday and Thursday, because we also say those psukim whenever we take the Sefer Torah out, whether it's a Shabbos, a Yom Tov, or a weekday when we read the Torah. But okay, I'm sorry that Professor Fox missed that. But anyways, so he's explaining, the problem. It's Rabbi Sachs that gives an answer to why it was so important to not just begin with the travel. And Rabbi Sachs writes, but Numbers does not start there with the travel. There is a long delay in the narrative. 10 chapters pass until the Israelites, not just 10 chapters, 420 verses, actually begin to travel. What was detaining them? Or rather, what was slowing down the story? Before we can join the people on their journey, we have to read about a census. Then comes an account of the arrangement of the tribes around the Ohel Moed, the portable temple, the tent of meeting. There was a long description of the Levites, their families, and respective roles. There are laws about the purity of the camp, restitution, a woman suspected of adultery, the Nazirite laws. At inordinate length, we read about the gifts brought by, that's a really boring chapter. That's the longest chapter in Chumash. Second longest chapter in all of Tanakh. That brings all of those gifts of the princes over and over, 12, 6 verses for each prince exactly alike, and we do it 12 times. Then come further passages describing the final preparations for the journey. Only then does the journey begin. Why the delay? Why this long series of seeming digressions? Okay, that's my question, but he asked it much more dramatically than I. But the Torah is not mere history as a sequence of events. The Torah is about the truths that emerge through time, the truths that emerge through time. I think that's a powerful expression. And in that fact is born the drama to which the whole Torah is commentary. How can freedom coexist with order? The Torah demands that we be free men, redeemed people. That's what Pesach is all about, right? We have to decide for ourselves. However, it's in a misgarret, it's in a framework. So before, I'm getting ahead of myself, let him say it. So first, God creates order. Then humanity creates chaos. So before the Jews can start to travel, we spend 19 days describing the Seder that they're going to have to maintain in the desert. And if they maintain that Seder correctly, everything's going to be hunky-dory. Everything's going to be cool. But they don't. And chaos ensues almost immediately. Next chapter, after they start moving, 3 days later, boom, we've got mitonanim. Everybody's kvetching, everybody's krächzing, and in terrible mood. Terrible consequences follow. Then God begins again, deeply grieved but never losing his faith in the one life form on which he set his image and to which he gave the singular gift that made humanity godlike, namely freedom itself. Freedom requires a framework. Yes, we should make decisions, and your decision might be different than my decision. I may decide that, that I want to wear this and you want to wear that, or I want to daven this way, or I want to daven that way, or what kind of profession. There is freedom. There are a lot of options within the non-Haredi world. In the Haredi world, the options are limited. But in the modern Orthodox world, I can be just as religious as somebody else and have all of these options and a lot of choices and freedom. But I have to stay in a framework. There has to be an overarching order in which I make my free choices. That long introduction at the beginning of Bamidbar, like I said, a third of the book, is all about creating a sense of order within the camp. Tragically, as Bamidbar unfolds, we see that the Israelites turn out to be their own worst enemy. God creates order. Humans create chaos. Bad things happen. Then God and Israel begin all over again. Will the story never end? And the answer is not until Mashiach. God gives us the framework, and we just find ways to disrupt the order and sense of things. But it's extremely important to understand that God provided the misgeret, the framework, the structure through which the Jewish nation should be able to thrive and succeed. But it doesn't take long before the whole system breaks down and people start complaining, and chaos sadly ensues, and with really lamentable results. The first result being that entire generation dies in the desert. But it happens other times too. We get a king, and we spend a lot of time talking about the king builds all of these, not just structures, but also rules for society, especially in the book of Malachim when Shlomo comes in. And it doesn't take long for that sense of order to to fall apart as well. And the same thing happens when Ezra returns, and he really tries very hard, not just to rebuild, but to set up a sense of order in society. And that doesn't last either. And right now we are going through another period of chaos after many of the things in our society were allowed or were broken down 8 months ago. A sad commentary on what happens throughout Jewish history and human history. But we Jews should know better, because God does give us guidelines to help us with the structure. And sadly, we don't pay attention. And we just have a beautiful example of it here. And so that, with Professor Fox and Rabbi Sachs, not talking about the way the sentences are worded, but looking at the overall structure of the literary work of the book of Bamidbar, come out with very beautiful and, I think, profound observations about Jewish society and what HaKadosh Baruch Hu expects from us. And that brings us to two fascinating comments by two Hasidic masters. And this is a Kabbalistic. What's the underlying spiritual message in these verses? It's a totally different question. In other words, the first group of commentaries that are dealing with Midrash are worried about the makeup of the wording of the verse. Why is it worded this way? What is God trying to teach us by this wording? Then we had two literary observers, Professor Fox and Rabbi Sachs, that looked at the big structure of the entire book. Now we're going back to the words. And what does this word mean spiritually? What is the spiritual message of God dictating this word for Moshe to write in the Torah? Okay, so we'll start with the Sfat Emet. And he says, notice that every journey was to fight the Sitra Achra. The journeys in the book of Bamidbar and in life, in our own lives, is not about getting from point A to point B. The concept of a journey is to confront our demons and defeat them. Sitra Achra is a Kabbalistic term for the other path. A Sitra is a path, Achra is another, but it could be translated the path backwards. If we were, talking in Star Wars terminology, we'd say the dark side. And that's what it is, that we're always fighting the dark side. We're always fighting the Yetzer Hara. And that's why we travel. Travel is me trying to get away from something bad, as it says. And it was when they journeyed, arise, O God, okay? Kuma Hashem, right? V'yafutzu oivecha, and disperse your enemies. Oivecha, your enemies. Oh, we're not dispersing our enemies. We're telling God to disperse his enemies. Now, some commentaries say right away that the enemies of the Jews are the enemies of God. And so there is no difference. But what the Rebbe is saying is disperse those evil forces in the universe that are God's enemies and our enemies secondarily, because they lead us to try to live a less spiritual life. This is the nature of weekdays. Weekdays are a constant battle with the Sitra Achra, the Yetzer Hara, with dark forces, okay? And it was when they rested. Oh, so in other words, the travel are weekdays. Uvenucho, the rest, that's Yom Menucha, that's Shabbat. So all of these references of traveling and resting are references spiritually in Kabbalah to weekdays and Shabbat. Go back to our sentence way at the beginning. They traveled from the mountain of God, Derech Shloshim, for 3 days, and there was the Ark of the Covenant of God traveled in front of them. They traveled for 3 days, Latour, to search out, to camp, to like scout out Menucha. What were they looking for? They're looking for Shabbos. There's weekdays, and we travel for 3 days. Why 3 days? Shouldn't it be 6? Let's go back to the Rebbe. And it was when they rested. That's the nature of Shabbat. It will always be thus. Travel on the weekdays and rest on Shabbat. Even if you don't get into a plane or a train or a boat, weekdays are about traveling through the world. Work, strife, all that's travel. Travail, if you will. There is the idea that there are 3 days before each Shabbat and 3 days after. Travel for 3 days looking for Shabbat. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Shabbat. Okay? Then at the end of the verse, it says, Derech Shloshet Yomim Latur Lehem Menucha. They traveled 3 days after Shabbat. So there are 3 days that we can survive because we're getting ready for Shabbat. And then that's Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And we're looking forward to Shabbat. And that gives us the energy to make it through spiritually through the week. And then Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, we are surviving based on the energy that Shabbat gave us. And there are 2 halachot based on this idea. Idea number 1, it is permitted to say Havdalah until Tuesday, because Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, Yom Rishon, Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi, are still connected to the Shabbat that was. Starting on Wednesday morning, if you look at the Shir Shel Yom for Yom Revi'i, the last 2 psukim to Yom Revi'is, to Wednesdays, Psalm for the day is we are already looking forward to Shabbat. And there's a halacha that if you find something on a Monday or a Tuesday that's like a treat, you can eat it right away. Starting on Wednesday, if you find something special, you should save either it or part of it for Shabbat. Because once you get to Wednesday, you're looking forward to Shabbat. And so when the Hasidim, the Kabbalists, look at the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash, it describes the week. In the middle is Shabbat, 3 candles on one side are the 3 days after Shabbat, 3 candles on the other side are 3 days before Shabbat. Shabbat is at the end of the week. Kabbalistically, it's the middle of the week. And without Shabbat, the week falls apart. So that's, according to the Rebbe, the Sfat Emet, the Again-Rabbi, that's what's going on. They're looking for Shabbos. The light of Shabbat extends for 3 days after each Shabbat, which is why you can say Havdalah till Tuesday. And as we begin to prepare for 3 days before it arrives, we can access the merit of the approaching Shabbat, which is why we quote verses from Kabbalat Shabbat on Wednesday morning. The energy I got from last Shabbos is gone. I have to start accessing the power of the coming Shabbat. That's what the Mechilta wrote about Shamor v'Zachor. Shamor is the 3 days before the coming Shabbat. Zachor, remember, is the memory, the power that's weakening from the 3 days after Shabbat. This is what the verse meant when it said they journeyed from the mountain 3 days. That was the 3 days after Shabbat, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. Then the Aaron traveled for 3 days. That was the 3 days before the next Shabbat. So there are 6 days in the Pasuk. Again, I look at the Pasuk again. They marched on the mountain 3 days. The Ark of Covenant traveled in front of them 3 days. 3 days away from Shabbat, 3 days towards the next Shabbat. That's what's going on the Kabbalistic level. Then the Aaron traveled for 3 days, that was 3 days before the next Shabbat. That is why the verse says to seek a menucha, latur lahem menucha. What were they looking for? That refers to preparing for the menucha of the coming Shabbat. This read that there should never be 3 days without a public Torah reading. The reason for reading the Torah on Mondays and Thursdays wasn't just because those were market days. It was because the community, the Jewish community, should never go 3 days without public Torah reading, because 3 days is how long the Jews can live either without Shabbat or without Torah. If you go more, you're going to die. It's like we need the booster shot of either Torah and or Shabbat. And that's what our verse is talking about. It's not talking about the desert bichlal. It's a mystical reference to life as a Jew. Beautiful interpretation, okay? And it's going to get added to with the comment from the Pri Tzaddik, Rabbi Tzadok of Lublin. The Sfat Emet wrote his comment in the 1870s, and Pri Tzaddik wrote his in the 1890s. Both of them in Poland, the or suburb of Warsaw, and the Pri Tzaddik in Lublin, southern Poland. Okay. The true issue here is that the days are really midot, spiritual attributes or attitudes. So it's not days. It's not a week. We're not talking about Shabbat. We're talking about the midot. What are the midot? Well, we have the famous 7 midot that each of the ish ushpizin who come to our sukkah on Sukkot, each one represents another midah. Okay, so the midot are chesed, gvura, tiferet, netzach, hod, yesod, and melucha. Okay, so we've got 7 attributes. So again, the 7 attributes, 3 days this way, 3 days that way, right? And this one in the middle, okay? So we still got it sort of referenced in the verse, but here we go. As we've already said, whenever the number 3 is used, 3 days at the beginning, 3 days at the end, whenever we talk about the number 3, it's really the first 3 of the midot, chesed, gvura, tiferet. We are really referencing the avot. Chesed is Avraham, Gevura is Yitzchak, Tiferet is Yaakov Avinu, who are the clarification of the first 3 midot, Chesed, Gevura, Tiferet, of the 7 midot, which are the sum total of a human life of sanctity. Those 7 character traits or sanctity traits are the sum total of a spiritual life. These 3 midot, why was it so important that the avot brought into the world these 3 midot? The kindness of Abraham, the strength of Yitzchak, and the tiferet, the glory of Yaakov, which is the combination of the previous 2. Put the 2 together and you get glory, okay? Because those 3 attributes repair, mitakein, are the tikkun, the repair, the fixing for the three initial human defects, which are kina, ta'ava, and kavod. Well, he doesn't say it, but in Kabbalistic writing, in Chassidic writing, kina was the sin of Cain, when he kills Hevel. It was over jealousy. Ta'ava, lust, is the sin of the generation of the flood, when they were lusting after other people's wives and other people's property as well. And kavod, this demand that I be given honor and glory, that was the sin of the building of the Tower of Babel, that people just wanted honor. And it comes our three patriarchs, and Avraham is the tikkun, repair for Kina. Yitzhak is the repair for Ta'ava. We control our lusts with gevura, with strength of character, and our own sense of tiferet, our own sense of personal worth means I don't need kavod. You don't have to show me any honor. I feel that in me through my neshama, through my soul. Okay. This brings us to the 3 days of travel from the Har, the mountain, during which they departed from the ways of God. They were moving away from the glory, the mountain, the high point of God. Like school children running out after school. This is a reference to what the Ramban said, but he's going to look at it differently. That they weren't trying to not get new mitzvot, like we said over there. They were just trying to get away from Hashem to do their own thing. They were hinting with this that after the Matan Torah, they traveled the road for 3 days. Each day hints at a deterioration. This is my translation. He said, Shemetz Pegam. Each day there was a little bit of a greater deterioration, Pegam, of one of the three midot. If you lose the midot of the avot, immediately the three terrible attributes of those earlier generations, kina, jealousy, ta'ava, lust, kavod, self-aggrandizement, those things creep in if I lose the character traits of the patriarchs. After this, we have the story of the deterioration of the nation. Even though it is, they became as complainers. First verse in the next chapter, mitonanim, everybody starts fetching and krachzing and complaining and just being a big pain in the backside. The Ramban teaches that this term is related to aven, mitonanim. They were like aven, as if they were sinning. Even though even though the specific sin isn't mentioned. But I believe that the sin was anger. Why? Because anger is the sin that happens when we lose self-control, when we lose that ability to feel good about ourselves and about the situation. Anger is that sin that comes in. That is why a fire, Aish, comes out from God and ravages the edge of the camp, and thousands of people die. In the Zohar, of course, the source of Kabbalistic thinking in Judaism, it explains that the verses, and there shall pass no fire in all your dwellings on Shabbat, lo sivar eish b'chol moshvotechem b'yom Shabbat, that when the one of the 39 prohibited acts of Shabbat that's specified in the Torah is don't allow fire to be transferred from one place to another in your house on Shabbat. Why symbolically do we mention that of the 39? Because means that there should be no anger in our homes, no fire, the fire of dissent and anger and upset in our homes on Shabbat. All the succeeding troubles happened in spite of the fact that the Aaron went 3 days before them to look for a place for rest. The Aaron was looking for rest for 3 days. Why 3 days? Because he was looking for a rest from the 3 negative midot. Each day was to get rid of another one of the midot, because Torah is a therapy for bad traits. Torah is a therapy. The Torah, learning Torah, helps us. Everybody has these negative traits in us. Everybody. But Torah is supposed to help us be able to deal with these personality issues that we all have. The Aaron, representing the Torah, was looking for rest from the 3 negative in, because the Torah is therapy for bad traits, especially anger. This matter is brought here as a guide for everyone about how to maneuver through life in this world. Specifically, this discusses getting through the 6 days of the week, the 6 days of work days of the week. These days we have work and war to clarify the 3 negative midot. We have to work and fight to do our best to keep those 3 negative character traits at bay. One's yetzer, one's inner feelings, one's inner drives must struggle to overcome them every day, as the aspect of Shabbat, which helps and supports us in the struggle to defeat these traits. Everyone requires support from God in this endeavor. We need HaKadosh Baruch Hu to bless our efforts. At the end of the verse, we say, to search for them menucha, for it is the menucha of Shabbat which eventually shows us how to defeat, fix, litakein, these midot. So in other words, the Midrash is, we said at the beginning, talking about how they traveled and they had a negative attitude. The literary was, we now are starting to move after all of this introduction to set up the process for moving. And then the Kabbalists say, you know what? The Psukim aren't really even talking about the desert. They're not talking about travel. They're talking about every Jewish life, every week of our lives. And we have to use the advice of this pasuk, which is, don't try to make it through the week without Torah guidance. That's how the Kabbalists look at our verse, that our own should always be our guide, getting through the week and helping us get from Sunday through to Shabbat. And it's just 3 totally different ways of looking at the pasuk. But I think each one has in its own right. But ultimately, the Kabbalists, I think, understood that when you read Torah, what you really need is advice for how to just maneuver, how to travel through your life. And we look at our lives based on week by week by week. And I just find that reading these interpretations, when you look at the verses, it takes a faraway story and brings it very much home for advice for all of us. Okay, thank you for joining, and everyone should have a great week and find our way to Shabbat without too many injuries along the way.
Amen.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye-bye.